A quiet night, a persistent disrespect. The heat of Montgomery's summer night was suffocating, the air thick with humidity, wrapping itself around every corner of the city like a heavy blanket. As the evening stretched on, the streets outside were bathed in the soft glow of street lamps, their light casting long shadows along the sidewalks. Inside Belmont, the upscale restaurant on Main Street, the atmosphere was a contrast, intimate, polished, and full of whispered conversations. The clinking of glasses, the soft rustle of linen napkins, and the subtle hum of classical music made the place feel like a world apart. It was the kind of restaurant where you could hear a pin drop if you listened closely enough, where every gesture had a refined precision, and where everyone knew their place. And Evelyn Johnson knew exactly where her place was. At 26, she had already learned to disappear within the walls of this restaurant. She had learned how to become part of the background, blending in with the endless shuffle of waitstaff who moved gracefully between tables, offering polite smiles and delivering orders with practiced precision. No one noticed the woman behind the tray, the one who slid in and out of the kitchen, quietly refilling drinks and ensuring that each table's needs were met without so much as a word exchanged. It wasn't that Evelyn wasn't capable of more. It was that here, in this world of rich patrons and overpriced wine, there was no room for people like her. At least, that's how it felt every night. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to existing in the silence between the clinks of fine china and the hum of idle chatter. Her role was clear: serve the guests, disappear again, and don't make a fuss. Tonight, however, something felt different. As Evelyn passed through the kitchen swing doors, the smell of sizzling steaks and fresh-baked bread filled the air. The clatter of pots and pans was a comforting noise, one that reminded her of her own constant rhythm, a rhythm that never seemed to slow down no matter how much her feet ached. She adjusted her apron, running her hand down its length to smooth out any wrinkles. Even the smallest imperfection could be a signal, a sign of weakness, and Evelyn knew better than to show any vulnerability here. She stepped into the dining area, her eyes scanning the room for any immediate needs. The patrons, well-dressed in their expensive suits and evening gowns, were engaged in quiet conversation, their faces alight with laughter, each voice dripping with confidence. They were all at ease, as though they belonged here, as though the world outside had no place in their thoughts. And they were right, Evelyn thought bitterly. This was their world, not hers. At one of the corner tables, a group of men in their late 40s, their faces sharp and weathered by years of success, sat laughing over glasses of wine. One of them, in particular, caught Evelyn's attention: Victor Price. He was the type of man who carried his wealth with a kind of arrogance that made people like Evelyn feel small. The first time he had come into the restaurant, a few weeks ago, she had noticed him immediately. He had a presence that was hard to ignore, a man who expected attention and always received it. He never missed an opportunity to draw attention to himself, whether it was by boasting loudly about his business deals or by dropping insults casually into conversation. Evelyn had done her best to avoid him, but there was no escaping the condescending looks he threw her way whenever she passed by his table. He didn't speak to her much, but his words were often aimed at the other staff in her line of sight, sharp jabs disguised as jokes, but they were anything but funny. Tonight, however, as she was delivering a bottle of red wine to another table, she heard his voice. "Is there a reason the waitstaff here looks so uncomfortable?" He called out loudly enough for several other patrons to hear. His eyes tracked Evelyn's movements across the room. She could feel the weight of his gaze as she turned her attention back to the table in front of her. Her heart began to race, a familiar unease creeping into her chest. "Maybe it's the pressure of being surrounded by people who actually matter," he continued, his voice dripping with mockery. A few chuckles erupted from his companions. Evelyn didn't look up. She had learned long ago not to react to people like him, to keep her head down and carry on. But his words stung, like paper cuts that added up over time. She smiled politely at the guests she was serving, but inwardly, her hands clenched into fists. She took a deep breath, willing herself not to let the hurt show on her face. "This is my job," she reminded herself. "I need this." But deep inside, she longed for a day when she could walk away from this place, a day when she didn't have to endure the scorn of men like Victor, who thought they were better simply because they had money. The evening stretched on, each minute dragging as if time itself wanted to prolong her discomfort. Evelyn found herself working faster, moving through the motions with a precision that came from years of practice. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and checked in on tables with a quiet efficiency that kept her out of the spotlight. She knew her role, and she played it well, but it didn't stop the gnawing feeling inside her, the feeling that no matter how perfect her performance, she would always be the help, always invisible. As the night wore on, the restaurant's atmosphere became even more tense. The hum of conversation turned into a dull buzz, and the soft clinking of silverware on china seemed louder. Evelyn was tired, but she pushed through it. The thought of the long walk home after her shift kept her going. It wasn't much, just a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, but it was hers. It was a small victory in a world where she had so little control. And yet, even as she prepared to leave, something told her tonight wouldn't be like the others. The final hour of her shift was upon her, and as the last of the patrons filed out, she went into the back room to grab her coat. Her muscles were sore, her feet ached, but all she wanted was to get out of this place and breathe. The cool air of the outside world was a welcome thought, an escape from the suffocating atmosphere that hung around Belmont. But as she reached for her coat, she heard the familiar sound of the door opening. A rush of cool air swept into the back room, and before she could turn around, the unmistakable voice of Victor Price cut through the silence. Well, if it isn't our favorite waitress," he called out. His voice was smoother this time, less mocking, but no less malicious. Evelyn froze. She didn't need to look at him to know he was standing there, just beyond the threshold of the back room. His presence was commanding, even in the dim light of the hallway. And then, just as she began to prepare for the encounter, she heard another voice, a voice that was unfamiliar, but filled with expectation. Victor stepped forward, and she turned to face him. His expression was different this time, no longer the smirk of the arrogant businessman who liked to throw his weight around, but something else, something darker. "You've been working here for quite some time, Evelyn," Victor said slowly, his eyes scanning her. "I think it's time we had a little chat." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively reached for her coat. This was no ordinary conversation, and she knew it. The game was about to change. The unexpected return. The back room felt suddenly smaller as Victor stepped closer, his polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor with a deliberate rhythm that echoed in the silence. His eyes, sharp and calculating, never left Evelyn's face. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, like he was trying to peel back every layer of her thoughts, searching for something vulnerable, something that would give him power over her. Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the edges of her coat as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. She had learned over the years how to navigate the discomfort of such encounters, how to smile when you wanted to scream, how to remain calm when everything inside you was in turmoil. But tonight was different. There was something about Victor's tone that sent a chill crawling down her spine. His usual arrogance was replaced by something far more insidious, and Evelyn's instincts told her that this encounter wasn't going to be like the others. "You've been working here for quite some time now, Evelyn," Victor continued, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, long enough to know how things work around here. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed her, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "But I think it's time for you to step up. Time for you to show us what you really have." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean by that? The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with every word he spoke, as though the very walls of the restaurant were closing in on her. She fought the urge to step back, to distance herself from him, but something in her made her stay, rooted to the spot. This wasn't about her job. It never was. This was something else, something that reached beyond the simple boundaries of a work relationship. Victor, sensing her unease, took another step closer, his face now inches from hers. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, too sweet and overpowering for her liking. He was a man who enjoyed control, who took pleasure in watching others squirm beneath his gaze. And right now, Evelyn was the perfect target. "You've been invisible long enough," he said, his voice low, almost like a whisper. "But that ends tonight. You've been hiding behind that apron, behind your little routines, but deep down, you know you're capable of more." He leaned in closer, his breath warm on her cheek. "I think it's time you showed us what you can really do. Don't you agree?" Evelyn's heart raced, her pulse quickening with each passing second. What was he asking her to do? She had never been one to draw attention to herself. She had spent her entire life perfecting the art of invisibility, of moving quietly through the world without anyone noticing her. But now Victor was forcing her into the spotlight, and she wasn't sure if she could handle it. Before she could formulate a response, the door behind Victor opened with a soft creak. Evelyn glanced over his shoulder, and her breath caught in her throat. A woman stepped into the room, tall and elegant, with an air of sophistication that immediately set her apart from the rest of the staff. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and her gown shimmered in the dim light, a deep shade of blue that reminded Evelyn of the ocean on a stormy night. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime being admired, her every step deliberate and calculated. Victor turned toward the woman, his grin widening. "Ah, there she is," he said, his tone dripping with pride. "Meet my friend, Isabel. She's the one who suggested we take this little detour tonight." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Isabel. She had heard the name before, whispered in the corners of the restaurant, always in connection with high-profile events, charity galas, and business deals that were far beyond her reach. Isabel was a woman of influence, someone whose presence commanded attention the moment she entered her room. And now, it seemed, she was part of this strange game Victor was playing. Isabel smiled at Evelyn, her expression warm but calculating. "It's lovely to meet you," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Victor tells me you've been with us for quite some time. You must have quite a few talents hidden away, don't you?" Evelyn felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had no idea what was happening, but she had an unsettling feeling that this was not just some casual conversation. There was something more to this, something far more dangerous than anything she had encountered before. Victor, sensing her hesitation, clapped his hands together with a loud snap, breaking the tension in the room. "Let's cut to the chase, shall we?" he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Evelyn, we've been watching you. Your work here, the way you move, the way you carry yourself. There's something about you that stands out. And Isabel, and I think it's time you showed us what you can really do." Evelyn frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Isabel stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "We've heard rumors, Evelyn," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Rumors that you have a hidden talent, something more than just being a waitress. I'm talking about your piano skills." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The piano. Of course, she knew it. The piano was a permanent fixture in the corner of the dining area, tucked away near the windows, almost as an afterthought. It was never used by the staff, never even touched, save for when the occasional pianist would come in to play for special events. But Evelyn knew how to play. She had learned as a child, back when she had the time and the luxury of dreaming. But those days were long gone. She hadn't touched the keys in years. Victor's smile widened as he saw her reaction. "You see, we think it's time for you to play for us, to prove you're not just some invisible waitress in the background. Show us what you've got." Evelyn felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. She had never played for an audience before, certainly not in a place like this, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a servant. And yet, as the pressure mounted, she realized something deep inside her. This wasn't just about the piano. It was about proving herself, not just to them, but to herself. She had spent years silencing the voice inside her that told her she was capable of more, of being more than just a quiet, invisible figure who existed in the background. She had buried her dreams, her talents, in the shadows of survival. But now, Victor and Isabel were demanding that she step into the light. And despite the fear that clung to her, despite the doubts swirling in her mind, Evelyn knew she couldn't back down. Not this time. With a shaky breath, she nodded. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll play." Victor and Isabel exchanged glances, and Evelyn could see the satisfaction in their eyes. They had won. But as she turned to walk toward the piano, a small spark of defiance flared in her chest. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for herself. She sat down at the piano, the cold keys beneath her fingers grounding her in the present. The room fell silent, the buzz of conversation from the dining area fading into the background. And as she placed her hands on the keys, she made a silent vow to herself. Tonight, they would see the real Evelyn. The melody of defiance. The soft click of Evelyn's heels against the polished floor seemed impossibly loud as she walked toward the grand piano, the silence of the room pressing in on her like an invisible weight. Her fingers, trembling slightly, brushed the edges of the keys as she took her seat. She could feel the cold, smooth surface beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the heat still lingering in her palms, left behind by the weight of Victor and Isabel's expectations. The piano sat there in the corner, forgotten by most, but it was a familiar sanctuary to Evelyn. She had once dreamed of playing before audiences, of feeling the music flow from her soul and into the world with the power to change everything. But life had never allowed her those moments. She had learned to bury that part of herself beneath the constant shuffle of plates and the harsh reality of working at a place like Belmont. The music was something of the past, a dream she had long abandoned. But tonight was different. Evelyn adjusted the bench slightly, trying to steady her shaking hands. She didn't need to look at the crowd to know. They were all watching her, their expectant eyes, those of Victor, Isabel, and anyone else who had stayed behind, were fixed on her every movement. She could feel their gaze like 1,000 tiny pricks against her skin, but she refused to let it break her focus. She had always played best when no one was watching. It had always been her escape, her silent rebellion against the life she had been forced into. And tonight, that same rebellion would rise again. Victor's voice broke the silence, smooth as ever, but now laced with a subtle anticipation. "We're waiting, Evelyn. Show us what you've got." Isabel's gaze was sharp, but there was something else behind it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe something more sinister, but Evelyn couldn't afford to dwell on it. The time for second-guessing had passed. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her chest, and then released it slowly. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She thought about the many nights she had spent practicing in the small, dimly lit room of her childhood home, her mother's voice calling out from the kitchen, the smell of dinner cooking in the air, the quiet thrum of life outside the window. She thought about her grandmother's gentle hands guiding her over the notes, her words encouraging her to keep playing even when the world seemed impossible. She thought about how the music had once made her feel free, even when the rest of the world seemed determined to hold her back. And then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod to herself, Evelyn's fingers pressed down on the first note. The sound was soft at first, hesitant, but as she continued to play, it grew. It filled the room, creeping into every corner, curling around the walls and sliding into the hearts of the people who had once thought her invisible. The melody was fluid, flowing as though it had been waiting to escape for years. Evelyn let the music carry her, and for the first time that evening, the weight of her doubts began to lift. Victor and Isabel exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing in surprise. Evelyn wasn't just playing. She was pouring something far deeper into the keys, something they hadn't expected, something raw and unrefined. It was a message, an unspoken declaration. She was more than the woman who served their food. She was a force, a person who carried her own story within her, a story that was not for them to control. The music swelled, and Evelyn found herself lost in it. It was as if every note was a step toward freedom, every chord a piece of her soul unfurling into the air. She wasn't just playing for them anymore. She was playing for herself, for the girl she had once been. The girl who had dreamed of a life that wasn't confined to the walls of a restaurant. The girl who had believed that her talent could carry her to something greater. Her fingers danced across the keys, the sound reverberating through the quiet restaurant like a storm building on the horizon. The patrons who had once been talking in hushed tones now sat in complete silence, unable to tear their gaze away from her. There was something captivating about her presence, something magnetic that drew everyone in. The melody she played was both haunting and beautiful, a blend of emotion that cut straight through the tension in the room. Isabel's eyes softened, but Victor's gaze grew sharper, more calculating. He hadn't expected this. He had expected to see a woman crumble beneath the pressure of his demands, to watch her falter and retreat back into the shadows where he thought she belonged. But Evelyn wasn't crumbling. She was thriving. As the piece reached its crescendo, Evelyn's hands moved with a fluidity she hadn't felt in years. The room seemed to fade away entirely. For a moment, she wasn't a waitress at Belmont, struggling to stay invisible. She wasn't the woman who had spent countless hours working in the kitchen, her talents ignored and dismissed. She was a pianist, a woman of power and grace, holding the world in her hands through the sheer force of her music. And then, as if the song itself had run its course, the final note rang out, lingering in the air, trembling against the silence that followed. The room held its breath, as if it too were afraid to break the fragile moment that had been created. Evelyn's hands remained poised over the keys, her fingers still, but her heart was racing. The music was still echoing in her ears, a vibrant pulse that seemed to connect her to everything she had been, everything she could be. She didn't dare look up at the crowd just yet. She didn't need to. She knew what she had just done. It had been more than a performance. It had been a statement. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the piano and let them fall into her lap. The weight in her chest, the fear that had clung to her so tightly just moments before, began to fade. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't someone's joke. She had just shown them all who she truly was. The silence in the room stretched on. Victor and Isabel exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance, but neither spoke. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, finally, Victor broke the stillness. His voice, when it came, was different from before. There was no mockery, no arrogance in it now, only something close to grudging respect. "Well, I didn't expect that," he muttered, though there was a glint of admiration in his eyes. "Impressive." Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already said everything she needed to with her music. Isabel, however, stood silently for a moment before stepping forward. "You've got quite the gift, Evelyn," she said, her voice softer now, more genuine. "You should have been doing this all along." But Evelyn didn't trust those words. She knew how easily praise could turn to manipulation when it was offered by people like Victor and Isabel. They had been waiting for her to stumble, to perform in a way that satisfied their expectations, and she had refused to play along. Instead of engaging, Evelyn stood and stepped away from the piano, her movements deliberate. She adjusted her coat, the familiar weight of it comforting against her shoulders as she glanced at the two of them. "I'm not here for your approval," she said quietly, her voice firm but soft. "And I never will be." Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped. But Evelyn had already made her decision. She wasn't going to stay for their games, their patronizing words, their cruel expectations. She had already shown them who she was, and that was all that mattered. With that, Evelyn turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, her steps echoing in the hushed silence, leaving Victor and Isabel behind. The night air outside felt cool against her skin, a refreshing contrast to the oppressive heat of the dining room. She had shown them her true self, something they would never forget. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like she was finally free. The silence before the storm. Evelyn stepped into the cool night air, the crisp breeze of Montgomery wrapping around her like a blanket. The sounds of the city, cars humming in the distance, the occasional voice from a passing pedestrian, felt far removed from the chaos she had just left behind in the restaurant. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, finally confronting the part of her that had been buried for years. The night sky stretched out above her, the stars twinkling like quiet witnesses to her small, yet monumental act of defiance. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air fill her lungs. It was as though everything had slowed down, giving her a chance to breathe, to reclaim herself. Her thoughts swirled. She hadn't expected the performance to feel so liberating. The moment she had pressed her hands to the piano keys, something inside her had broken free. It was more than just the music. It was a declaration that she was no longer willing to shrink herself for the sake of others' comfort. It had taken years for her to get here, to this exact moment. But now that she felt an unfamiliar sense of power pulsing through her veins. But it wasn't over. It couldn't be. The truth was, she had only scratched the surface. Victor and Isabel's surprise would wear off, their curiosity would fade, and they would eventually return to their comfortable roles in the world. But Evelyn wasn't just another face in the crowd. She wasn't going to let them reduce her to a mere novelty act for their amusement. There was something bigger at play here, something that called to her from deep within. Evelyn had always known there was more to her life than what she had allowed herself to see. The piano, her music, it had been a part of her soul, a way to express what words never could. But she had spent so many years burying that part of herself beneath layers of survival and self-doubt. She had convinced herself that she didn't deserve to be more than what she was, that her dreams were too big, too impossible for someone like her. But now, standing in the stillness of the night, she felt something different. Maybe it was the music that had stirred her again, or maybe it was the recognition that she had something inside her that was worth sharing. No one, not Victor, not Isabel, not even the world she had grown up in, could tell her who she was anymore. She was Evelyn Johnson, a woman with a gift, and that gift was meant to be shared. Her hand brushed against the railing of the restaurant's back patio, the familiar rust of the metal grounding her. The silence around her was both a comfort and a warning. There was a storm brewing in her chest, a storm of emotion, of frustration, and of hope. Inside Belmont, the atmosphere was tense, thick with a mixture of confusion and admiration. The patrons had barely whispered a word since Evelyn had finished playing, unsure of what to make of the unexpected performance. No one had anticipated that a simple waitress would hold such talent, such raw emotion within her, and certainly no one had expected her to leave the way she had, silent, resolute, leaving Victor and Isabel to confront the consequences of their own actions. Victor stood near the piano, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his lips pressed into a thin line. Isabel stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, as they processed what had just transpired. Victor broke the stillness first, his voice sharp with the edge of someone who had been unexpectedly challenged. "Well, that was certainly something," he muttered, his eyes following the direction Evelyn had walked. "I didn't expect that kind of performance." Isabel gave him a sidelong glance, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You never do you? You think you know someone, and then they do something that shakes your entire worldview." Victor's eyes narrowed at her response. "I didn't ask for a lesson in humility, Isabel. I think you just got one," she replied, her voice cool, a glint of amusement dancing in her eyes. "You underestimated her. We both did." Victor's jaw clenched, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I never underestimated anyone. I simply wanted to see how far I could push her." "It's a game, Isabel. A game she played into." "Did she, though?" Isabel asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I don't think she played by your rules, Victor. She showed you who she really is. And that's not someone you can control with your little power games. Victor turned toward her, his face tightening with irritation. This isn't about control. It's about understanding your place in the world. Understanding one's place, Isabel repeated, her voice soft, almost reflective. Funny. That's exactly what Evelyn did. She's no longer invisible. She's not playing by anyone's script. And that scares you, doesn't it? Victor's gaze flicked toward the door, the place where Evelyn had disappeared into the night. He wasn't sure why, but the idea of her walking away, so confidently, unsettled him. She hadn't given him the satisfaction of a reaction. She hadn't crumbled, hadn't begged him to stop the humiliation. She had simply played, and in doing so, had taken control of the moment. And now, he realized with a sharp pang, she was gone. Evelyn Johnson was no longer the waitress who could be pushed around. She was someone else entirely, a woman with power, with fire, with a voice that demanded to be heard. Outside, Evelyn had begun to walk, her feet carrying her along the familiar path that led toward her small apartment on the outskirts of town. The stars above had started to shift, their glow faint but still present, as though they too had witnessed the shift that had occurred within her tonight. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but for the first time, the chaos felt manageable. She had faced her fears head-on, and in doing so, had revealed the strength she had buried for so long. But what now? What would happen when the night ended, and she returned to her everyday life? Her fingers lightly grazed the silver locket around her neck, a gift from her mother that had somehow survived all these years. She hadn't thought about it in ages, but tonight it felt like a quiet reminder. Her mother had always told her that her voice mattered, that she could do anything if she just believed in herself. Evelyn had never truly understood that advice until now. The streets were quiet as she walked, her thoughts slowing, the pressure on her chest easing with every step. She wasn't sure what was next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a choice. She didn't have to play the role of the invisible waitress anymore. She didn't have to silence her talent, her dreams, or herself for anyone. There was something bigger waiting for her, a future she hadn't yet imagined. And tonight, she had taken the first step toward claiming it. The night held its breath, and so did she, but in that silence, there was no fear, only possibility. A path carved in silence. The next few days felt like a blur. Montgomery seemed to hold its breath after that night. Velmaun, the posh, high-end restaurant, resumed its usual flow of guests, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The usual whispers about the latest celebrity sightings, or who had ordered the most expensive bottle of wine, were now tinged with curiosity. Every time someone mentioned the incident, they spoke in hushed tones, as if they feared acknowledging it would break the delicate spell that had settled over the room. Evelyn hadn't expected this kind of aftermath. She thought she would simply slip back into her routine, the same routine that had kept her hidden, invisible. But somehow, it was different. She had woken up the next morning with the weight of 1,000 possibilities pressing on her chest, and the thought of returning to Belmont filled her with a new sense of dread. But she couldn't stay away. Not now. Her shift began as usual, arriving early, tying her apron with practiced hands, and walking into the grand dining room, its lavish decor never quite matching the disconnection she felt as she moved between the tables. The soft click of her shoes against the marble floor still felt oddly louder than before. But there was something else now, a quiet presence of defiance, as if she had entered into a new phase of her life, one where she wasn't required to remain silent. Victor and Isabel hadn't said a word to her since that night. Evelyn didn't expect them to. She could sense the shift in their behavior. There was a strange, almost respectful distance that they kept, and though she had no illusions about their true natures, it was clear that they no longer saw her as a mere waitress to be humiliated or toyed with. She had become something more, a woman who refused to be broken by their words or their expectations. And it wasn't just them. Other patrons, regulars who had once barely glanced her way, now offered her looks of admiration. though they tried to hide it behind polite smiles or murmured comments. They knew. The music had changed everything, even for them. Evelyn had shown them that she was more than just the woman who brought their bread and butter. That was the way it was, Evelyn realized. In the world she inhabited, people never truly saw each other until something extraordinary happened. But that was fine. She had never needed their approval. She had never needed to be their center of attention. But for the first time, the power to make a difference was hers. The question was, what would she do with it? It was late in the evening when it happened. Evelyn had just finished clearing a table in the corner when she felt a pair of eyes on her, a gaze that was familiar yet different. She turned and found Isabel standing by the bar, a drink in her hand, her posture more relaxed than Evelyn had ever seen it before. There was no longer the air of superiority, no playful condescension. Instead, there was something like genuine curiosity in her expression. Evelyn hadn't expected to see Isabel approach her, but as she walked toward her, Evelyn didn't look away. She wasn't afraid anymore. Isabel's heels clicked softly against the floor as she closed the distance between them, her eyes soft but sharp. "Evelyn," Isabel began, her voice quieter than usual, almost careful. "I didn't think you'd come back after what happened." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She simply wiped her hands on her apron, a motion that gave her time to consider the right words. Isabel's eyes followed her every move, waiting for some kind of response. "I wasn't sure either," Evelyn finally said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something deeper in it, a trace of uncertainty that she couldn't entirely suppress. "But I'm here now." Isabel nodded thoughtfully, her lips curling into a small smile. "You played beautifully that night." "I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that." Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on her, but now there was a quiet strength behind her words. "I'm not here to impress you, Isabel." The words hung in the air between them. Evelyn had not meant to sound as blunt as she did, but there was something about the situation that made her bluntness feel necessary. Isabel tilted her head slightly, as though she was contemplating Evelyn's words. She looked over Evelyn's shoulder, as if searching for some deeper meaning in the moment before returning her gaze to Evelyn. "That's exactly what I admire about you," Isabel said quietly, her voice laced with a hint of something more than just politeness. "You didn't play to our expectations, and you didn't need us to approve. That's rare." Evelyn took a step back, trying to let the tension between them dissipate. There was something off about this conversation, like Isabel was trying to understand Evelyn on a deeper level. She wasn't sure she liked it, but she wasn't ready to turn away either. Isabel had always been the type to use her charm as a weapon, to manipulate situations for her own gain. Evelyn wasn't about to fall into that trap now. "You may admire it," Evelyn said, her voice firm but composed, "but I don't owe you or Victor anything. I'm not here to entertain you, and I'm certainly not here for your approval." The words felt powerful as they left her lips. She had never said something so direct to Isabel before, never allowed herself to be so honest. She could see the shift in Isabel's expression, a flicker of something like respect, or perhaps it was something darker, something she wasn't ready to fully understand. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The quiet hum of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, and the gentle murmur of conversation around them filled the space where their words should have been. But Evelyn wasn't uncomfortable. She wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. Isabel finally broke it, her voice soft. "You've got fire, Evelyn. Don't let it burn out." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The sincerity in Isabel's voice was unexpected, and for the first time, Evelyn saw her not as the cruel, dismissive woman who had once looked down on her, but as someone who understood, someone who had been trapped in a world of her own, just like Evelyn had. But Evelyn wasn't willing to get caught up in her world. She had her own path now. "I won't," Evelyn said quietly, her eyes locking onto Isabel's. "I've got more to give than this restaurant. I know that now." Isabel didn't respond. She only took a long sip of her drink and then walked away, leaving Evelyn to stand there, watching her go. There was no bitterness, no final word, just a quiet understanding between them. Evelyn turned toward the back door, her heart racing slightly, but not in fear. It was something else, something new. She had never been this sure of herself before, never felt this powerful. She was ready for whatever came next. But as she stepped into the still night air again, Evelyn knew something important had shifted, not just in her, but in the world around her. It wasn't just a coincidence that she had played that night. It was fate. The music had broken through all the walls she had put up, and now there was no going back. She had taken her first step towards something bigger, and she wasn't about to let anyone, Victor, Isabel, or anyone else, stop her from walking that path. Her future was hers now, and it was just beginning. Rebirth in the echoes of her song. The days that followed felt like a slow unfolding. Evelyn knew, deep within her, that things could never be the same. Her life, her choices, her identity, all of it had been altered by that one act of defiance, by the moment when she stepped into the spotlight and let her hands speak for her. She had tasted freedom, and now there was no way to go back to the life she had known before. Belmont still held its air of exclusivity, the same well-to-do patrons trickling in each evening, enjoying their expensive meals and finer wines. But Evelyn no longer saw it as a cage, a place where she was invisible or subjugated to the whims of others. It was simply a stepping stone, one part of her journey, but not the whole. The music she had played on the piano was still echoing in her heart, and it was calling her, urging her to rise above the mundane and into something greater. The world was far too large for her to remain stuck in the corner of a restaurant, serving the whims of those who would never truly see her. Her decision was made. Evelyn had saved enough money over the years to start anew. She would leave Montgomery, leave Belmont behind, and find a place where her music could thrive. She had already begun researching studios in larger cities, venues that might welcome her talents. It wasn't about fame or glory. It was about making her mark, about sharing the gifts she had been given in a way that wasn't dictated by the expectations of others. She wasn't going to let herself be small anymore. She was ready to step into her own light. But even as she made her plans, there were still lingering threads of the past, people who weren't ready to let her go. Victor, of course, had tried to reach her. His arrogance had only grown since that night, his power and wealth blinding him to the fact that Evelyn no longer cared about his approval. She had known men like him all her life, men who believed they could shape the world to their liking, men who thought their influence could buy anything, but she had already bought her freedom. No price could take it away from her. Isabel, however, was different. Evelyn hadn't expected to see her again, not after their conversation. Yet, she found herself standing before her one evening, the elegant woman's face more earnest than usual. Evelyn had just finished her shift and was preparing to leave when Isabel approached her, her heels clicking softly on the polished floors. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Isabel said, her voice stripped of its usual artifice. There was no mocking tone, no subtle judgment, just a quiet revelation. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "Leaving?" Evelyn repeated. Isabel nodded. "I'm moving on. There's nothing left for me here. You were right about everything." Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that. She had never seen Isabel as someone who would acknowledge their shared truths, especially not in such a direct way. Isabel had always worn her wealth and status like armor, constantly protecting herself from vulnerability. But now she seemed almost human. "I guess we both got what we needed," Evelyn said, her voice softer than usual, reflective. Isabel hesitated, her eyes locking with Evelyn's. "You've changed, Evelyn. You've grown stronger. I think that's what scared me most. You've always had this strength, but you didn't show it. Until that night." Her voice was quieter now, almost as though she were speaking to herself. "It's terrifying, in a way, when someone like you steps out of the shadows. You make people question everything they thought they knew about themselves." Evelyn absorbed Isabel's words, feeling something shift inside her. She had always been aware of the way people looked at her race, her position in life, her place in the world. But Isabel's words made her realize something deeper. She had never fully recognized her own power. The people around her had always been afraid of what they couldn't control. And now, for the first time, Evelyn understood that. She wasn't just a part of someone else's story. She was writing her own. "You've always hidden behind that mask of perfection, Isabel," Evelyn said gently. "But I think you're starting to see that there's more to life than playing it safe." Isabel didn't flinch at the words. Instead, she smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I wish I had the courage to do what you did, to walk away from it all, and start over." "You still can," Evelyn replied softly, feeling the weight of those words. They were a truth for both of them. The silence between them stretched long, neither of them needing to say more. The bond between them, though brief, had deepened. They understood each other in ways neither of them had expected. And in that moment, it didn't matter who they had been. What mattered was who they could still become. Isabel was the first to break the silence. She stepped forward, and to Evelyn's surprise, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Good luck, Evelyn. Don't let anyone dim your light." Evelyn stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of Isabel's words settle into her chest. "You too," she replied, her voice steady. As Isabel walked away, Evelyn felt something new stir inside her. The anger she had carried for so long, the bitterness, the sense of being wronged. It was all beginning to fade. She had been through the fire, and she had come out stronger for it. Now, it was time to take the next step. That night, after leaving Belmont for the last time, Evelyn walked the streets of Montgomery with a new sense of purpose. The city had been a place of survival for her, but it wasn't her future. The lights of the city flickered like distant stars, and Evelyn felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. But it wasn't heavy. It was light. It was freedom. She had decided, in that moment, that her future would no longer be dictated by anyone else's standards. She was going to be the woman she had always known she could be. The woman who played the piano like she was breathing, who sang with the voice of someone who had found her place in the world. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about living her truth. As the days passed, Evelyn began to make plans. She would leave Montgomery behind. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would be hers. She would seek out the music that called to her, find the stages that would allow her to share her story with the world. And with each note she played, with each song she wrote, she would remind herself of the power she had always carried within her. She was Evelyn Johnson, a woman who had been made for greatness, and she would never again let anyone convince her otherwise.